What if I told you that the most terrifying, unstoppable military machine of World War II was secretly brought to its knees by a group of mocked, under-equipped teenagers? In 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army had crushed the British. They had humiliated the Americans. They feared absolutely no one. But deep in a rotting, disease-infested jungle, they encountered something so shocking and so deeply humiliating that Japanese commanders immediately classified the reports. For decades, the standard history books have hidden the full truth. But today, we are opening the translated and top-secret diaries of Japan's highest-ranking generals, and what they secretly wrote about these so-called amateur Australian soldiers changes everything we thought we knew about the Pacific War. Why did Japan's deadliest, battle-hardened veterans suddenly panic? Why did they officially rewrite their entire jungle combat manual, ordering their troops to multiply the enemy's numbers by 3 out of sheer terror? The answers are buried in a classified document that was never meant to see the light of day. You need to watch this video until the very end, because the final diary entry we uncover today will leave you absolutely speechless. Let's dig in. By July of 1942, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had reached a conclusion that seemed absolutely terrifying for the rest of the free world. The southern advance of the Japanese war machine was completely unstoppable, rolling over empires and swallowing massive territories in a matter of weeks. The British military forces had already proven spectacularly useless, while the American defenders at Bataan had fought desperately before eventually surrendering to the overwhelming pressure. The Dutch were completely wiped off the board, leaving only one final target in the South Pacific crosshairs. The Australian forces, according to the top-secret Japanese military assessments, represented nothing more than a pathetic lower tier of threat compared to these previously vanquished opponents. Japanese intelligence viewed these desperate defenders as mere colonial troops who were operating in an unforgiving terrain they simply did not understand. These men were commanded by officers who answered to a distant British chain of command that had already demonstrated catastrophic incompetence across multiple international theaters. The classified assessment from Tokyo was deeply arrogant but incredibly direct, stating that Australian resistance in Papua would be exceptionally light, completely disorganized, and humiliatingly brief. The operation to capture Port Moresby was officially codenamed Operation RY, and the military plan was considered elegant in its absolute simplicity, but this arrogant assumption would soon become the greatest scandal in Japanese military history. Rather than attempting another dangerous seaborne landing, Major General Tomitaro Hori and his elite South Seas detachment would push straight over the treacherous Owen Stanley Range via the Kokoda Track. Their ultimate goal was to descend rapidly onto the coastal plain and take Port Moresby from the vulnerable landward side before anyone could stop them. Imperial intelligence confidently estimated that the muddy track was easily passable for their hardened veterans. They firmly believed that any Australian resistance would be effortlessly swept aside in a matter of mere days. However, as classified documents later revealed to a shocked world, Japanese intelligence was catastrophically wrong on virtually every single count that actually mattered on the battlefield. Hori's South Seas detachment was absolutely not a random collection of fresh-faced recruits or nervous conscripts drafted at the last minute. These ruthless men had already fought victorious campaigns at Rabaul, at Guam, and during the brutal ground component of the Battle of the Coral Sea. They were incredibly lean, fiercely disciplined, jungle-experienced warriors who traveled notoriously light and moved through the dense green canopy faster than any Western army had ever believed possible. When the advance elements of this formidable force crossed the Kokoda Gap and began pushing down the southern slopes in late July of 1942, they were intoxicated with supreme confidence. They vastly outnumbered the terrified Australians waiting in the shadows, they completely outgunned them, and they carried the massive psychological weight of an unbroken string of global victories. Yet all their prestigious medals and combat experience could never have prepared them for the absolute shock waiting in the mud. What the Japanese elite forces entirely lacked was any genuine understanding of exactly who was waiting for them at the end of their rifle barrels. The desperate men holding the muddy track in those critical first weeks were primarily members of the 39th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force. This was a hastily assembled militia unit, not a highly trained regular army formation with years of professional preparation. In the highly contemptuous and mocking language of that era, these young boys were officially nicknamed the Chacos, which was short for chocolate soldiers. The professional military establishment cruelly believed these kids would simply melt away at the very first contact with real enemy fire. Their average age was barely 19 years old, and many of these frightened teenagers had received only a few miserable weeks of basic military training before being shipped to the unforgiving jungle. Their standard issue rifles were barely serviceable, their critical ammunition was strictly rationed, and their cheap boots were already disintegrating in the permanent wetness of the rotting jungle floor. These boys possessed absolutely no heavy tanks, zero artillery support, and completely lacked any realistic prospect of receiving vital reinforcements in any time frame that actually mattered. Their pathetic daily rations consisted primarily of salty bully beef and rock-hard biscuits, assuming those meager supplies ever arrived at the front lines at all. But the impending tragedy was about to flip the entire Pacific War completely upside down. These starving, exhausted, and seemingly abandoned teenagers were exactly the men that Japan's absolute finest jungle soldiers walked blindly into. The resulting encounter produced shocking outcomes that nobody in Tokyo, nobody in General Douglas MacArthur's lavish headquarters in Brisbane, and nobody in the entire British Empire had ever anticipated. Captured Japanese documents and the heavily guarded personal records of senior officers eventually revealed a truth that the Imperial Army desperately tried to bury forever. The very first theme that emerged from the classified Japanese accounts of the Kokoda fighting was an overwhelming, almost paralyzing sense of absolute surprise. This profound shock was not due to the Australian numbers, because the Japanese commanders fully knew they substantially outnumbered the pathetic defenders during the early phases of the campaign. The surprise was definitely not about Australian firepower either, since the exhausted 39th Battalion had absolutely nothing that could even dent the Japanese advance. The sheer astonishment stemmed entirely from the terrifying Australian stubbornness that defied every known rule of modern warfare. Japanese officers began filing panicked dispatches describing an absolute refusal by these boys to behave the way an outmatched, under-equipped, and half-trained colonial militia was mathematically supposed to behave. This blatant defiance was the first major crack in an empire that believed itself to be completely invincible. Japanese tactical doctrine had been brutally honed through years of vicious campaigns in China and Manchuria, built entirely on one simple psychological foundation. The central premise was always that the enemy breaks, whether immediately or eventually, once supply lines are cut, and the psychological pressure becomes completely unbearable. Chinese armies had historically broken, British forces had spectacularly broken, and American garrisons had broken under the immense weight of this exact same doctrine. The strategy had worked flawlessly across half the globe simply because the underlying military mathematics had always been correct. But deep within the nightmarish green hell of Kokoda, that invincible doctrine suddenly stopped working completely. You only need to look at the unbelievable conflict that unfolded at Isurava in late August of 1942 to understand the sheer magnitude of this military scandal. By this critical point in the campaign, Major General Hori had fully committed the massive bulk of his elite South Seas detachment to the final push over the rugged mountain range. He had approximately 5,500 heavily armed men available for immediate offensive operations. These were seasoned, well-equipped veteran fighters who were heavily supported by devastating mountain artillery batteries. Against this unstoppable tsunami of steel, the desperate defenders seemed destined for absolute tragedy. Standing directly in their path, the Australians had somehow scraped together the battered remnants of the 39th Battalion and the newly arrived 21st Brigade. These reinforcements were completely exhausted from their agonizing march up from Port Moresby, leaving the entire defending force with perhaps 1,500 effective fighters at the very beginning of the relentless conflict. By every single conventional military calculation taught in the finest academies, this engagement should never have been an actual contest. The elite Japanese vanguard should have effortlessly rolled through Usarava in exactly 48 hours and marched directly down the slope toward their final objective within a single week. Instead, the ensuing clash dragged on for 4 agonizing days of the most savage close-quarters combat ever witnessed in the entire Pacific campaign. When the smoke finally cleared and the Australians conducted a brilliant fighting withdrawal under strict orders to preserve their remaining strength, the scene left Japanese commanders completely speechless. The Imperial soldiers absolutely did not break through the Usarava position with their usual terrifying speed and devastating efficiency. They were forced to grind through it, bleeding heavily for every single miserable meter of muddy terrain, while facing massive losses that their rigid timetable had simply never budgeted for. The true scandal, however, was hidden within the frantic letters sent back to Imperial headquarters. The hopelessly outnumbered Australians had miraculously stalled an entire army while being outnumbered roughly 3-1 in terrain that heavily favored the attacker. They accomplished this impossible feat with absolutely no resupply, no immediate relief, and no prospect of external assistance arriving in time to prevent a massive catastrophe. Shocked Japanese battalion commanders immediately began filing desperate reports that utilized language their arrogant superiors had never expected to read. One after another, these classified documents described the young Australian infantrymen as tenacious beyond any previous Japanese experience with Western military forces. The non-commissioned officers of the Australian forces were singled out repeatedly in these secret enemy dispatches for their uncanny battlefield brilliance. The Japanese were horrified by their enemy's incredible ability to maintain solid unit cohesion under relentless pressure and organize improvised defensive positions in terrain that offered zero natural strong points. Furthermore, these supposedly amateur teenagers were actively mounting aggressive local counterattacks exactly when Japanese officers had mathematically calculated that the defense must surely be near total collapse. This level of terrifying initiative forced the highest levels of the Japanese command to completely rethink everything they knew about war, and then came the ultimate confession from one of Japan's most feared military minds. Lieutenant General Tsutomu Yoshihara, the highly respected chief of staff of the Japanese 17th Army, was suddenly forced to draft a document that shattered the entire Bushido myth. Yoshihara was a hardened veteran who never offered compliments to his enemies. Yet he openly wrote that the incredible adaptability of the Australian soldiers made them genuinely outstanding fighters. He shockingly noted that these teenagers utilized the rugged jungle landscape on an almost instinctive level, finding concealment where maps showed absolutely nothing. Even more terrifying for the Japanese command was the fact that these Australians continued to fight effectively and completely autonomously even after their commanding officers were lost to the battle. According to Yoshihara's stunning admission, these boys possessed an individual battlefield initiative that rigidly trained Japanese troops simply could not replicate. He ultimately used a specific Japanese military term that translates directly to the word superb, forever cementing the legendary status of the chocolate soldiers. This was not just a passing observation, but a terrified professional warning from a master tactician who realized his invincible empire was finally bleeding. The teenagers who were supposed to melt in the jungle heat had single-handedly broken the invincible aura of the Japanese war machine, and the Pacific theater would never be the same again. The staggering mathematics of sheer terror completely consumed the greatest military minds within the Imperial Japanese Army during the brutal autumn of 1942. What initially began as a glorious march toward inevitable victory had rapidly transformed into a deeply humiliating intelligence disaster of absolutely unprecedented proportions. The terrified Japanese commanders on the ground were systematically exaggerating the actual number of Australian defenders by a massive factor of 3 to 5 times their true strength. This astonishing systematic overestimation was not just a simple clerical error, but rather a profound psychological collapse that forced proud generals to completely lose their grip on battlefield reality. The fierce resistance they encountered in the mud was so devastating that their rigidly trained minds simply could not comprehend that they were being systematically dismantled by a handful of starving teenagers. The absolute peak of this classified military humiliation unfolded in the dark, suffocating gorges surrounding the treacherous waters of Yura Creek. The supposedly invincible 144th Infantry Regiment, an elite Japanese unit boasting an absolutely spotless combat record across the globe, found itself completely paralyzed for 3 agonizing days. Terrified Japanese intelligence officers frantically reported back to their headquarters that their advancing troops were facing a massive, heavily fortified battalion backed by devastating artillery barrages. The shocking reality, which was later uncovered in highly classified enemy archives, revealed a truth so intensely embarrassing that Tokyo desperately tried to bury the documents forever. The mighty Japanese regiment was being continuously stalled and brutally punished by exactly 112 exhausted Australian boys carrying nothing but standard-issue rifles and an unbreakable willpower. But if you think that humiliating defeat was the worst of it, brace yourself. This catastrophic miscalculation was merely the first bloody domino to fall in a completely unstoppable chain reaction that would permanently shatter the Japanese war machine. The renowned Japanese jungle specialists completely failed to execute their signature flanking maneuvers because the defending militia reacted with a speed that defied all established rules of modern warfare. Every single time the Imperial troops attempted to sneak through the dense foliage to surround the enemy, they were violently intercepted by aggressive Australian patrols who had somehow already anticipated their most secretive routes. Desperate Japanese company commanders were forced to write incredibly humiliating operational reports to their superiors, officially blaming their catastrophic failures on the unnatural speed and shocking aggression of the colonial forces. These seasoned veterans, who had previously conquered half the globe without breaking a sweat, essentially admitted on official military paper that young boys from the suburbs of Sydney were vastly superior jungle fighters. The sheer irony of this historical moment remains absolutely breathtaking when you carefully examine the raw tactical data extracted from those rain-soaked ridges. The Imperial Japanese Army had painstakingly built its entire terrifying reputation on ruthless efficiency, yet their highest-ranking officers were now desperately drafting pathetic excuses to explain away their devastating losses. They genuinely believed that generating such an overwhelming defensive wall required thousands of highly trained professional soldiers because their strict military doctrines simply possessed no category for individual initiative on the battlefield. The incredibly brave young Australians were actively rewriting the global rulebook of jungle combat in real time, forcing the greatest military machine in the Pacific to essentially hallucinate phantom armies in the creeping shadows. However, this shocking psychological collapse was just a tiny warm-up for the real disaster. What happened next would trigger the ultimate strategic tragedy, permanently altering the brutal course of the entire Pacific War. By early September of 1942, Major General Tomitaro Hori had pushed his exhausted forces all the way to Ioribiwa Ridge, representing the absolute final natural barrier before the coastal plain. The ultimate prize was so tantalizingly close that the exhausted Japanese soldiers could actually clearly see the glowing city lights of Port Moresby flickering in the dark distance on clear nights. By every conventional military standard ever written, the brutal campaign was practically finished, requiring only one final decisive push to secure a monumental victory for the expanding Japanese empire. The defenders were pushed to the absolute breaking point, their supply lines were hanging by a microscopic thread, and the mighty Imperial Army stood right on the precipice of absolute regional domination. And right at this tantalizingly close finish line, with absolute victory staring him in the face, General Hori made a single catastrophic mistake that instantly dragged his entire invincible army straight into an inescapable living nightmare. Gazing out toward the distant city lights, the veteran commander became completely paralyzed by the overwhelming fear of sustaining massive casualties during the final bloody assault. His deeply flawed intelligence network had thoroughly convinced him that a fresh, heavily fortified force of 4,000 Australian soldiers was eagerly waiting to completely obliterate his vanguard. The devastating reality was that the muddy ridge was held by approximately 1,000 severely malnourished, disease-ridden boys who were barely clinging to consciousness. The mighty Japanese general blinked at the final hurdle, ordering a fatal halt to offensive operations that would ultimately cost him the entire Papua campaign and doom his men to unimaginable devastation. But this single moment of pure tactical cowardice was just the opening act. It immediately sparked a relentless, horrifying plunge into a suffocating green hell that these undefeated invaders could never have possibly imagined in their worst dreams. The catastrophic pause at WWII Ridge allowed the global strategic situation to shift dramatically against them, forcing Imperial headquarters to hastily divert critical resources toward the escalating conflict at Guadalcanal. General Hori received the devastating order to immediately withdraw on the 24th of September in 1942, completely shattering the aggressive morale of his proud army. What began as a boastful, glorious conquest instantly devolved into a horrifying, desperate retreat through a mountainous wasteland where thousands of proud soldiers would ultimately perish from severe starvation and rampant tropical diseases. The arrogant hunters had suddenly become the hunted, and the deeply humiliated Imperial forces were about to experience a completely new dimension of sheer tactical terror. The pursuing Australians, despite suffering from equally horrific physical conditions, unleashed an aggressive counteroffensive that completely shattered every single Japanese defensive doctrine ever written. These incredibly resilient young men relentlessly chased the retreating veterans through the mud, absolutely refusing to allow the Imperial forces any opportunity to establish solid rearguard positions. The Australian infantry began executing impossible tactical maneuvers, actively moving through the impenetrable jungle terrain during the darkest hours of the night, a miraculous feat that Western troops were previously deemed entirely incapable of achieving. They appeared exactly like terrifying ghosts in locations where complex Japanese mathematical calculations insisted they could not possibly be, completely terrorizing the retreating columns and destroying whatever little discipline remained among the Imperial ranks. Yet the most chilling evidence of this absolute psychological destruction was still waiting to be discovered. It was captured perfectly in a frantic, top-secret dispatch written by a trembling Japanese commander during the absolute darkest days of their miserable retreat. This deeply disturbed officer reported that an incredibly aggressive Australian infantry unit had successfully infiltrated exactly 300 meters directly past his heavily guarded forward positions without making a single audible sound. This completely silent penetration of 300 meters occurred in absolute pitch darkness, completely defying the basic laws of military science. The impossible maneuver was executed through a suffocating jungle environment so incredibly dense that moving during broad daylight usually required a razor-sharp machete and hours of exhausting physical labor. The deeply shaken Japanese commander openly admitted in his official documents that he possessed absolutely no tactical explanation for how this completely impossible feat had been accomplished by starving colonial troops. He frantically recommended that all future defensive planning must operate under the terrifying assumption that no Japanese position was ever truly secure from these unseen phantoms. The absolute masters of the Pacific had been thoroughly broken by a ragtag militia, leaving the Imperial war machine completely humiliated and forever scarred by their catastrophic miscalculations on the muddy slopes of the Kokoda Track. The ultimate triumph of the Australian forces was not truly measured in the medals pinned to their chests or the official parades held in their honor back home. The genuine, unvarnished proof of their staggering historical victory was actually locked away inside the highly classified military documents of their greatest enemy. The Imperial Japanese 8th Area Army, utterly humiliated and completely desperate to prevent another catastrophic massacre, was forced to take an unprecedented step. They officially ordered the immediate rewriting of their entire sacred combat manual for jungle warfare, fundamentally altering how the Empire would fight for the rest of the brutal conflict. This was an incredibly profound admission of defeat from a proud military establishment that historically refused to acknowledge any weakness whatsoever. In these newly revised top-secret tactical directives, the highest-ranking Japanese strategists permanently abandoned their previous arrogant assumptions about colonial troops. They explicitly warned their frontline commanders in plain, undeniable text that Australian infantry massively outperformed the British Army in absolute every single jungle combat scenario. Furthermore, the classified manual boldly declared that these underestimated teenagers possessed combat capabilities that fully equaled and sometimes even exceeded the highly trained American forces. The Japanese High Command actively documented how these young boys commanded an unnatural, almost terrifying proficiency for night movement and completely unpredictable small unit tactics. They realized that their strictly rigid, highly centralized command structure was no match for the raw, devastating individual initiative shown by these desperate Australian boys. But the most shocking revelation hidden inside these recovered enemy documents went far beyond just recognizing Australian bravery. It introduced a completely new tactical mathematics that proved just how deeply terrified the Japanese Empire had truly become. The revised military manual officially instructed all future Japanese commanders to actively apply a specific strength multiplier whenever they faced Australian infantry on the battlefield. This extraordinary directive essentially mandated that if Japanese intelligence reported 100 Australian soldiers holding a muddy ridge, Imperial forces must aggressively plan their attack as if they were fighting 300 highly trained veterans. The High Command warned that the devastating tactical effect produced by these relentless boys consistently exceeded what their actual physical numbers could possibly predict on any conventional military map. This was the mighty Japanese Empire, on official military paper, directly telling its most elite generals that estimating the actual number of Australians would guarantee their absolute destruction. It is arguably the most striking, profoundly respectful tribute ever paid to the Australian soldier, completely bypassing their own government to come directly from the trembling hands of their terrified enemies. This overwhelming respect was further cemented by the deeply personal, highly classified diaries recovered from the battlefield after the disastrous Japanese retreat. Major General Tomitaro Hori, the proud veteran who led the initial unstoppable invasion, sadly lost his life crossing the treacherous Kumusi River during the chaotic withdrawal in late November of 1942. When Australian intelligence finally translated his recovered personal journals, they did not find the arrogant boasts of a superior commander complaining about his bad luck. Instead, they uncovered the frantic, deeply honest writings of a seasoned warrior grappling with the sheer impossibility of what he had just witnessed in the suffocating mud. He openly confessed that the Australian ability to magically disappear into the deadly terrain went entirely beyond any formal military analysis he had ever studied in his long, prestigious career. Yet, the horrifying truths recorded in these dead men's diaries would soon unleash an even bigger wave of psychological terror across the remaining Imperial forces. What the surviving Japanese veterans whispered to each other in the shadows proved far more devastating than any official military doctrine. Japanese soldiers who somehow survived the relentless nightmare of the Kokoda Track spoke of their enemy with a mixture of profound professional awe and genuine psychological terror. One deeply traumatized veteran, interviewed decades after the brutal conflict, described the absolute futility of fighting young men from the suburbs of Brisbane and Adelaide who somehow behaved as if the deadly jungle was their own backyard. He famously stated that engaging these boys was unlike any combat he had ever experienced across China or Malaya, because the Australians ruthlessly defended the rotting terrain as if they personally owned the ground they stood on. These seasoned jungle veterans were absolutely haunted by the terrifying silence of Australian night patrols, knowing that the absolute absence of sound usually meant an unstoppable nightmare was already creeping up directly right behind them. This massive psychological burden severely crippled Japanese operational planning for the remainder of the Pacific War, costing the Empire countless thousands of unnecessary casualties. The incredible tragedy of this monumental historical truth is that the exhausted, Disease-ridden boys walking off the muddy Kokoda Track in the late months of 1942 had absolutely no idea what they had actually achieved. They did not know that they had completely shattered the invincible aura of the Japanese military machine, or that terrified enemy generals were frantically rewriting their most sacred tactical manuals because of them. And these brave boys only knew the agonizing pain of a brutal fighting withdrawal, the heavy sorrow of leaving their closest mates behind in the unforgiving mud, and the desperate, overwhelming desire to finally just go home. The official history books eventually credited their unimaginable suffering with saving Port Moresby and buying critical time for the Allied forces to finally shift the entire strategic balance of the Pacific theater. But the official history books completely miss the most spectacular, awe-inspiring victory of the entire bloody campaign. The greatest conquest wasn't measured in miles of muddy terrain, but in the total psychological destruction of the enemy's mind. The true, undeniable victory of the Kokoda campaign was secretly won inside the terrified minds of the very men who had arrogantly marched into the Owen Stanley Range expecting an incredibly easy slaughter. Men like General Yoshihara and General Hori left behind an immortal record that speaks far louder and far more honestly than any official government history or polished bronze monument ever could. They arrived expecting to effortlessly crush a pathetic, half-trained colonial militia, but instead they collided violently with an unbreakable wall of pure Australian defiance that fundamentally altered their entire perception of war. This brutal discovery, violently written in blood across the absolute worst terrain on the face of the earth, permanently changed how the Japanese military approached the terrifying problem of fighting Australians for the rest of their crumbling empire's existence. The Chacos, the chocolate soldiers, the rabbits, the invincible Japanese army was forced to rewrite its most sacred tactical manuals specifically because of them. That is an absolute fact that no number of official medals, grand parades, or beautiful monument inscriptions has ever quite captured with the exact same raw precision that a highly classified, deeply terrified Japanese military document perfectly manages to convey simply by existing.